Hello, my name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the academic director and founder of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. We're going to be talking today about chapters 6 and 7 of Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. These are two of the important chapters in the section of the book on imperialism, and specifically on the importance of race and racism for imperialist rule. It's important to understand that race and bureaucracy, which are the topics of these two chapters, are what Hannah Arendt calls devices for imperialist rule. In fact, the two main devices for imperialist rule, which is not the same as totalitarian rule. It's a precursor to it, and we need to both understand imperialist rule and then totalitarian rule. Imperialism and imperialist rule is rule over subject peoples. And it's important to us to realize that imperialism is not nationalism, because nationalism and the nation is not capable of imperialist rule because the nation is based on principles of self-determination and consent. And when a nation takes over another people, there is a slow but sure drive towards independence. Imperialism is about the subjection over subject peoples, and racism and bureaucracy are the two key devices in this imperialist rule. The key section of these two chapters is the final section of race and bureaucracy, which is called the imperialist character. And this is where Arendt brings race and bureaucracy together to understand imperialism. And that section begins with this paragraph that's really worth us looking at closely. She writes, "Of the two main political devices of imperialist rule, race was discovered in South Africa and bureaucracy in Algeria, Egypt, and India." So there are two main devices of imperialist rule, race and bureaucracy. Race is discovered in South Africa, and imperialism in Algeria, Egypt, and India. She continues, "The former, race, was originally the barely conscious reaction to tribes, of whose humanity European man was ashamed and frightened, whereas the latter, bureaucracy, was a consequence of that administration by which Europeans had tried to rule foreign peoples, whom they felt to be hopelessly their inferiors, and at the same time in need of their special protection." So, race, or racism, was a reaction to tribes, and here she's thinking in South Africa. You have especially the Dutch settlers, the Boers, come into South Africa and experience the native African tribes, who they were appalled by. Not, Arendt says, because they were black or because of the color of their skin, but because they lived in a world that seemed so inhuman to the Dutch and to others, a world that had that was savage or pre-civilizational, if you want to think in those categories. This doesn't mean that Arendt embraces those categories, although she does understand and argue that any people that lives worldlessly, by that she means lives more in tune with nature and less with an artificial creative world, lives closer to animals and less like humans. And she takes that literally. Now, that's not to her a racial claim. She argues in this chapter that the Boers, the Dutch settlers, were savage, and they became worldless while they were living in South Africa. But in this instance, what she's saying is that the Dutch encountered the African natives and saw them both as inhuman and yet human, which led the Dutch to see themselves as superhuman, as chosen, as divine, as a savior people. So that Race, she writes, in other words, was an escape into an irresponsibility where nothing human could any longer exist. Namely, the Dutch thought themselves gods. And that's an irresponsible viewpoint, to escape into an irresponsibility where they were superhuman, chosen people. And then she continues, bureaucracy was the result of a responsibility that no man can bear for his fellow man and no people for another people. In other words, bureaucracy said, we are going to civilize you. We are going to care for you. We are going to rule you because you can't rule for yourself. It is because of racism, by which we see you as inferior and us ourselves as superior and godlike, that we embrace bureaucracy, which is the responsibility to rule you and, in a sense, cure you of your ails. That's, in a nutshell, the way that racism and bureaucracy work in these two chapters, to show that racism as this ideology of superiority and inferiority combines with bureaucracy as a mode of ruling that assumes responsibility for people that no man can bear, and it does so by then making no one responsible for it. What bureaucracy does is it denies that any single person is responsible for this rule. It's a rule of offices, and the result is that unbearable responsibility is made bearable by no one actually being the ruler. The bureaucracy rules, not any particular human being, which is why she sees bureaucracy as so deeply inhumane and inhuman a ruling force. Now to sort of work our way through the chapters, and I hope not too long away. The first chapter on race thinking before racism argues on page 158 that racism has been the powerful ideology of imperialistic policies since the turn of our century. She calls it an ideology. And on 159, she gives a slightly larger or longer definition of what racism is as an ideology. She writes, quote, an ideology differs from a simple opinion in that it claims to possess either the key to history or the solution for all the riddles of the universe, or the intimate knowledge of the hidden universal laws which are supposed to rule nature and man. The two great ideologies of the modern era, Arendt argues, are Marxism, which is an ideology which says that history is understood as an economic struggle of the classes, and racism, which says that history is a natural fight amongst the races. For her, racism and all ideologies are not scientific, they're pseudoscientific, but what they really are is political. They're political weapons. Marxism and racism are political weapons. And to the extent that they are supported by science, that science is always secondary. So that Darwinism, she says, which is another ideology insofar as we think of genetics and social engineering, she says, is a consequence of the might equals right ideology, not its cause. Darwinism springs from a belief that society is a struggle of the weaker and the stronger, and it is a weapon used by the stronger to justify their victory, right? And that is part of her critique of Darwinism. Within the question of racism and race, she says that race became a weapon for domination. And she says this on page 206 in one place. It's worth looking at. Quote, the full impact of the African experience and recall that racism, she says, is discovered in Africa. The full impact of the African experience was first realized by leaders of the mob, like Karl Peters, who decided that they too had to belong to a master race. So they saw inferiors, and what it led them to conclude was that they were master race superiors. She continues, African colonial possessions became the most fertile soil for the flowering of what later was to become the Nazi elite. Here they had seen with their own eyes how peoples could be converted into races, and how simply by taking the initiative in this process, one might push one's own people into the position of the master race. The Boers and their elevation of themselves into a master race over the Africans becomes the first model for modern racism in Arendt's telling. So if first racism is an ideology, and secondly it's a weapon, the third quality of racism for Arendt is that it's not nationalism. In fact, race tends to destroy the body politic of the nation, she says on page 161. And she continues, racists have a worse record of patriotism than the representatives of all other international ideologies together. And they were the only ones, the racists, who consistently denied the great principle upon which national organizations of peoples are built, the principle of equality and solidarity of all peoples guaranteed by the idea of mankind. Races deny that there's a solidarity based on nationalism, on the idea of a nation state where everyone in the state is a citizen and has the equality of the citizen. And thus racism always destroys the body politic of a nation. It's a weapon, she says, of destruction, and one of the things it destroyed was the nation state. And that becomes one of the themes, as we've been talking about, of this book. The nation state as a place in which all people are equal, have legal rights, have a political and public persona, and where there are political limits to the to both economic appropriation and social discrimination. The fourth characteristic of racism that she talks about in these chapters is rootlessness. So she can say that rootlessness is characteristic of all race organizations. Out of a hate for the world, racism can imagine the destruction of the world. This is this idea that out of a deep rootlessness and feeling of despair, people can so hate the world that they actually want to destroy the world. She writes on page 195 that racism as a ruling device was used in this society of whites and blacks before imperialism exploited it as a major political idea. Its basis, and of course its excuse, were still experience itself, a horrifying experience of something alien, beyond imagination or comprehension. It was tempting, she says, indeed simply to declare that these were not human beings. Since, however, despite all ideological explanations, the black men stubbornly insisted on retaining their human features, the white men could not but reconsider their own humanity and decide that they themselves were more than human and obviously chosen by God to be the gods of black men. This again is this idea that racism is an ideology, a weapon of superiority and inferiority. Here we see that it denies the idea of Christian and national equality. It denies limits, and it elevates one people to be the divine saviors of man. This idea of racism that she develops is contrasted in chapter 6, called Race Thinking Before Racism, with what she calls race thinking. This is a controversial and I think fascinating dispute, one that largely has been ignored in both Arendt scholarship and in thinking about racism itself. But the argument in a nutshell is that race thinking is an opinion. You can have an opinion about white people, black people, Jews and Christians and Muslims. You can have an opinion about Americans versus Germans versus French versus Chinese. And these are some of the free opinions. And some of these opinions are prejudicial, discriminatory, stereotypical. But the opinions themselves, while they can be mean and ugly, and sometimes quite wrong, are just that. They're opinions, and they are not ideologies that are used as political weapons. And so in this chapter, what she does is she argues that there is a long history of race opinions, race thinking, and she traces 5 different versions of it throughout this chapter. But they are different from racism, which is a weaponized ideology. And so she concludes on page 182 at the end of this chapter, and she says, but even the eugenicists, even the slave holders in the 18th and early 19th centuries, she says, were not racist. They justified holding slaves as temporary, she says. And by the way, this is borne out by a lot of other research on early slaveholders. They still thought that they could make the world a unified humanity. But it's only once the people turn from simply race thinking and racial justifications to ideologies that are weaponized that they become out and out racists. And so she can write, quote, there is an abyss between the men of brilliant and facile conceptions and men of brutal deeds. And that's something we all need to keep in mind today in thinking about racism and also in thinking about the world of politics. There's a lot of opinions out there, and some of them are nicer and prettier, and some of them are uglier and meaner. But there's an abyss between brilliant and facile conceptions and brutal deeds. And I think today, too often, we forget that abyss. For Arendt, imperialism, she says, would have necessitated the invention of racism as the only possible explanation or justification as an excuse for its deeds. And that is the connection between racism and imperialism. In chapter 7, on race and bureaucracy, she's really focused here on, as we said before, bureaucracy and race as the 2 devices of imperialism. And I want to focus just on 2 examples she gives at the end of the chapter. The first is Lord Cromer, who's actually the Earl of Everlyn Baring from England, who between 1877 and 1907 was the British proconsul general for the British occupation of Egypt. And as the occupier of Egypt, Lord Cromer developed what he called a philosophy of the bureaucrat, or what Arendt calls the philosophy of the bureaucrat, or what he called a hybrid form of government. And the premise here is that you had a democracy, more or less, over in England, but Lord Cromer ruled with an iron fist in Egypt. And yet he justified it as for the good of the people, for the good of the Egyptians, to westernize them, to take away their uncivilized ways and religions. And so he says on 211, quote from Lord Cromer, led solely by a sense of sacrifice for backward populations and the sense of duty to the glory of Great Britain, that has, quote, given birth to a class of officials who have both the desire and the capacity to govern. These colonial bureaucrats sacrifice themselves for a backward population, and they have the desire and capacity to govern. They're, he says, to have personal influence without legal treaty, not law, bureaucracy. And we often think of laws and bureaucracy as synonymous. Bureaucracy is too many laws. But bureaucracy is not really about laws. It's about regulations, and regulations that can be changed and personalized. And the bureaucrat is someone who can move beyond the law. The idea is that in bureaucracy, the rules could be altered at a moment's need to deal with crises, and thus bureaucracy required highly trained, expert staff who had renounced ambition. They didn't want to become famous. They didn't want to become an elected ruler or a king. They simply wanted to do a good job and suppress and subject a subject people. And thus, the bureaucrat had to have a passion for secrecy, to govern behind the scenes. So why would a bureaucrat do this? To renounce glory, have personal influence, but not get the rewards for it. And Cromer's answer is that what the bureaucrat gets is power. He can do what he will and what he needs. It's a government of experts in power. And so on 216, Arendt writes, and here's summing up this idea of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is always a government of experts, of an experienced minority, which has to resist, as well as it knows how, the constant pressure from the inexperienced majority. It's a small group of experts that have to, in a sense, resist democracy in order to rule well. And then she writes again on 216, that was on 214, this is on 216. At the basis of bureaucracy as a form of government and of its inherent replacement of law with temporary and changing decrees lies this superstition of a possible and magic identification of man with the forces of history. The ideal of such a political body will always be the man behind the scenes who pulls the strings of history. And so that's the mystery of the bureaucrat. It's the insider, never runs for office, always behind the scenes, who pulls the strings of history. And this is similar to what she calls the secret agent, which is the other figure besides the bureaucrat, who is essential in the story of imperialism and modern rule. I don't want to go into it too long, but the example she offers here is T.E. Lawrence. It's an amazing story. And I'll just read you one quote that we can end with about T.E. Lawrence, which is on 220 to 221, and I'm going to skip a little bit in it. She writes, "The story of T.E. Lawrence, in all its moving bitterness and greatness, was the story of a real agent or functionary, of somebody who actually believed he entered, or had been driven into, the stream of historical necessity and become a functionary or agent of secret forces which rule the world." Although Lawrence had not yet been seized by the fanaticism of an ideology of a movement, probably because he was too well educated for the superstitions of his time, he had already experienced that fascination based on despair of all possible human responsibility, which the eternal stream and its eternal movement exert. He drowned himself in it, and nothing was left of him but some inexplicable decency and a pride in having pushed the right way. He wrote, "I am still puzzled as to how far the individual counts. A lot, I fancy, if he pushes the right way." And Arendt adds, "This then is the end of the real pride of Western man, who no longer counts as an end in himself, no longer does a thing of himself, nor a thing so clean as to be his own, by giving laws to the world, but has a chance only if, quote, he pushes the right way, in alliance with the secret forces of history and necessity, of which he is but a function." Both the bureaucrat and the secret agent, in a sense, subordinate themselves to historical forces and to the secret functionings of those historical forces led by a government. When those secret forces become ideological forces, racist forces, and eventually forces of a movement bent on total domination, they become the instruments of totalitarianism. as we will see as we get further into the book. For now, I hope you enjoy reading these 2 chapters. I look forward to talking with you about them. Thanks very much.